Welcome to Polaris Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China and the impact on the world. This program is co sponsored by the Foreign Policy Association of New York, brought to you live, which means that our viewers can ask questions by using the chat button on the right hand side of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as time allows. As a reminder, PolarisLive.com is a commercial free, viewer supported channel. You can help us by subscribing to our YouTube channel and newsletters at Kashmeri.com. With the impending Israeli invasion of Gaza, in retribution for the massacre in Israel by Hamas militants, the gathering of two powerful U.S. aircraft carrier groups in the Mediterranean Sea, and the threat of further attacks in the West Bank, the world appears on the brink of what may be a global conflict. But this latest conflict comes as there is an unfolding power shift taking place in the Middle East. The emergence of China as a major commercial and political pair, potentially upending the prior U.S. dominance in the Arab world. What's next? That's a momentous question facing our world today. To help our viewers understand what's at stake, the Foreign Policy Association and PolarisLive.com invited 5 global experts to help our viewers understand what's at stake. Today, in the second of the special programs, we have with us Mr. Chip Usher, Senior Director for Intelligence at the Special Competitiveness Studies Project. Prior to SCSP, Chip served 32 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, where he held a variety of executive positions. Also with us, Dr. James Ketterer, Senior Fellow at the Center for Civic Engagement at Bard College. He recently completed a 4-year term in Egypt as the Dean of the School of Continuing Education at the American University in Cairo. Gentlemen, welcome to Polaris Live.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Good morning.
Hello.
Let me start by asking you, a recent New York Times column was titled, "Israel has never needed to be smarter than in this moment." Well, has Israel's action thus far been smart? Let's begin with Dr. James Ketterer and then Chip Usher.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when President Biden was in Israel, he spoke, I think it was when he was in Israel, he spoke about Israel not making some of the same mistakes that the U.S. had made after 9/11. And I think it bears thinking about, well, what were some of those mistakes? What were the kind of categories of those mistakes? And do we see them underway or not? Sarwar, in your introduction, you were mentioning the impending invasion of Gaza, and you used the word retribution. And I think that the word impending sounds to me like an inevitability and just an inevitable momentum forward on a certain set of actions that really can't be pulled back. And I think now, as that column was suggesting, is a time to consider, well, what actions need to be taken? And the word retribution, and I know that, you probably don't want it held against you, but the word retribution sounds to me like something that is akin to revenge. And revenge is understandable on an emotional level, but not something that really meets the test of strategic thinking. And I think what that column is saying and what President Biden was saying, that now is a time to have a very strategic sense about not only what actions to be taken next, what's the strategic overall arc of this, and then what tactics will support that, and not the reverse. And it seems to me when we think about the United States and lessons learned post 9/11, one is to avoid in the heat of the moment and with the desire for retribution, to use that word again, an overreach and a disproportionality. and that would be a mistake. And if that is underway already, that is something that really needs to be addressed, because it's not in the strategic interest of Israel. It's certainly not in the interest of the people who are on the receiving end of this. The other is that we certainly made the mistake of is unilateralism. And although the details would be different between U.S. actions then and Israel now, I think that paying close attention from the Israeli perspective to the web of relationships and relations that have been established, and to think about what damage has been done and might continue to be done if unilateral actions are taken in a way that doesn't. I don't just mean the U.S.-Israeli relationships. I mean with the Arab states, with the Europeans, with others. That would be a problem. And then the issue of mission creep, and in some cases, as people have suggested, occupation, the reoccupation of Gaza, and a real sense that this would be very, very bloody for all involved and on all sides. But in addition to it, I think that it begs the question that Colin Powell, I believe, said is the most important and least asked question in Washington. And then what? What really is the mission? What's the end goal? What is the intended result of all of these tactical decisions? And it's of course, I'm not privy to these conversations, but at this moment it appears to be unclear, and I think that there are real divisions within the leadership in deciding the answers to those questions.
Thank you for that. Chip Usher?
Well, I agree entirely with the comments that James just made. I think we're probably in between phases of the Israeli response. Clearly, their intelligence and security services were caught flat-footed by the 7 October attack. The first order of business was to resecure the towns and villages along the border with the Gaza, to resecure the border. That phase was completed a few days ago. And now what we're seeing is the next step, the preparatory phase of going into Gaza potentially. And that includes a large number of airstrikes, which are clearly visible to us as we watch the news. Less visible to us are probably special operations and other covert actions that are happening on the ground in Gaza, collecting intelligence, trying to pinpoint the location of the hostages and pinpoint the location of Hamas infrastructure and fighters. So in answer to your question, is what Israel has been doing so far smart? I think it remains to be seen what develops in this next phase. What Prime Minister Netanyahu has said to the world, Israel is now at war with Hamas, and they seek to destroy Hamas's capability, its military capabilities, against the people of Israel. That makes obvious sense in light of the 7 October attack and what Hamas has done against Israel over the years. But what we haven't heard yet from the Israeli side is what else is part of the plan? What are their other political objectives? And I have not heard a definitive answer from this new coalition cabinet as to what that entails. Now, what it might entail is, an answer to what James asked, which is what then? And what I would imagine, based on my experience working with the Israelis over the years, is there's probably a conversation going on right now within the cabinet about restoring deterrence against Iran, against Lebanese Hezbollah, against the other Shia militant proxies of Iran across the region, which in recent days, as we have seen, have joined with Hamas in attacking Israel. So that's going to be a key priority, is to restore the deterrence against those groups. I would hope that there is a serious conversation about what is to become of the Gaza Strip after the IDF sweeps in to remove Hamas fighters and destroy their infrastructure to include their long range, short range rockets and missile threats against Israel. So, that's a very complicated question to answer. Who will be the controlling authority? How quickly could Israel turn over civilian control to some other entity? Those sorts of things. And then beyond that, what is to become of engagement with the other Arab states, particularly in the Arabian Gulf, who were beginning the process of perhaps entering the Abraham Accords. So clearly that was something of interest to the Israeli side, and how do they get back on track with that? And then finally, as they do all of this, maintaining the close support of the United States is going to be absolutely critical. So with these broad objectives in mind, I think it's incumbent upon the Netanyahu administration to express, which priorities they will be pursuing and how they seek to achieve them. To be perfectly honest, this is a rather tall order to achieve all of those goals. Perhaps it's best within the capabilities of the Israeli state to sweep into Gaza, occupy it for some short amount of time, and quote unquote destroy Hamas's military capability. But to do some of these other tasks will require a lot more resources, potentially on the part of the IDF or other Israeli security services, and concerted diplomatic effort by not just Israel, but its friends and allies across the region to achieve these larger aims. So it's unclear to me yet whether Israel's strategy is going to be smart in the holistic sense and ultimately successful. So I share James's concern that these issues yet have to be addressed.
Thank you for that. I wanted to stay at the strategic level for a moment longer. Dan Kurtzer, the former U.S. ambassador to both Egypt and Israel, told Polaris Live viewers last week that Hamas is really a socio-religious grouping, that killing its leaders, decapitating them, killing a lot of its members isn't going to eliminate it. So if the stated objective of Israel is that, and that's what this U.S. ambassador believes is true, then do you think Israel needs to rethink its strategy? Chip, I'll let you continue on, and then James, we'll come to you.
Well, first of all, in terms of Hamas as an organization, I think the events of the 7th of October ought to prove to the entire world how morally bankrupt, how vicious, a malign actor this group is. Yes, I agree with the ambassador that it does serve several functions in the Gaza Strip, but this group is beyond the pale. If its previous acts of terrorism weren't enough to convince you, the fact that they just killed 1,400 Israelis, amongst them citizens from some 35 other countries who had dual citizens in the area, this ought to convince you. Hamas is irredeemable, in my view. So I think both may be true at the same time, that they did provide social services. They ran hospitals. They provided other municipal services to the people of Gaza. They were the controlling authority, but they were run much like a criminal gang. And the people at the top are the militants who were responsible for this horrific attack. Now, it comes back to that issue of, well, if not Hamas, who is going to be the controlling authority in the Gaza Strip? And that's still a very difficult question, because I don't believe the Palestinian Authority, which is centered in the West Bank, is any better position today to reinsert itself as the controlling authority in that in that area. It was thrown out in 2006, and it hasn't reestablished the legitimacy or the roots that it would need to do that.
James?
Yeah, I think this is also a good point to add in the perspective of one of the key actors in this entire drama, in fact, this tragedy, which is Egypt, a place that I've just spent the last 4 years in, and had also been there on another time. And because I think that the Egyptian relationship with Hamas and with Gaza also indicates the very complicated and delicate nature of where the Arab states see themselves right now, and the nature of Hamas. So the current government of Egypt, run by President Sisi, former General Sisi, has no love for Hamas. When General Sisi took power in 2013, it was done so by removing from power Mohammed Morsi, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so in Egypt's role in kind of quote unquote managing Gaza, where part of the border abuts Egypt, they have worked hand in glove with the Israeli government. The Egyptian government has worked hand in glove with the Israeli government on this. And this is, in part because of the peace accord that exists between Israel and Egypt, but it is also in part because of the antipathy that the Egyptian regime has for Hamas and groups like Hamas. That having been said, this current crisis has, in Egypt and across the Middle East and North Africa, has really, I think, very much underscored the reality that the Palestinian issue has not gone away for most people across the region. There was a sense that this was an issue that could be circumvented, that could be pushed to the side, that the regimes would, whether it's through the Abraham Accords or other real or potential agreements, would not have to calculate into the mix the Palestinian issue. And I think that we see so many countries where the quote unquote Arab street has risen up and spoken so vociferously on this issue that regimes like in Egypt and in other places have now had to strike a very tough balance on this kind of strategic thinking, as you were mentioning, Sarwar, and at the same time their local domestic politics. President Sisi is standing for re-election. I mean, we can have another conversation on how free and fair that election might be, but he has an election coming up in December. Egypt, before this crisis broke out, is in very tough straits. The economy is really battered. There are all sorts of other issues at play, and this creates perhaps some political opportunities for the regime, but at the same time, some real difficult challenges. And I mean, Egypt has them in many ways, but these are shared by countries really across the region. So I think that's what I was saying at the beginning too. We can't just think of this as a bilateral issue, Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Gaza. I mean, Chip mentioned, and I think it's crucially important to keep in mind, what's going on in the West Bank and what has been going on in the West Bank, just not in general, but particularly in the last few months after the current Israeli government was put in place. I mean, the West Bank was, for many people, I think, where they thought something really was going to happen. And that's, I think, in part why so many people were surprised by what came from Gaza. But it's not. This is not a bilateral issue. This is in of itself, the nature of it, this highly complex, interlocking system. We see all aspects of this interlocking system being affected, and in different, and in some ways, I would say, unpredictable ways.
If I could just add to James, because I couldn't agree more. For decades, up through the Oslo peace process, the animating idea behind much of the U.S.'s foreign policy in the region was sort of an inside-out approach, that if the U.S. could broker a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians and stabilize that situation, this would allow for more normalized relations and better relations for the U.S. across the region. What was attempted in more recent years, starting under the Trump administration, is sort of an outside-in approach, that Israel had moved so far beyond the Palestinians in terms of its 2.0 economy, its heavy investments in advanced technologies. It had become more westernized, and that there was growing affinity and growing economic linkages, potential and realized between Israel and other Arab states, particularly in the Gulf. And so this was one of the germinating ideas behind the Abraham Accords. I think one of the underlying assumptions of that was that the Arab streets' motivations or sympathy towards the Palestinian people had waned, and that the Palestinians essentially could be coerced or forced into some sort of arrangement, the terms of which would be established by Israel, Arab Gulf states, with support of the U.S. and other outside powers. For better for worse, the events of 7 October, I think, have really put a nail in the coffin of that idea. People involved in this issue need to re-recognize that the Palestinians have a voice, that they are an agent in this, and that there will not be a solution without them. Personally, I hope that has nothing to do with Hamas, but that need for a viable political path forward for the Palestinian people remains. And so no durable solution, in my estimation, is possible unless, the international community, again, puts energy behind trying to see that process begin again.
So I'm going to stick with you just a moment longer, Chip, and then come back to you, James, because there are two really important points that you all have made. One is this is not just a bilateral issue, and I want to return to that. But I want to follow up with what you just described so elegantly, Chip Usher, and ask you that for the longest time, a two-state solution was said to be the be-all and end-all for this enigma in the Middle East. Is this two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state living next to one another in peace, is this still valid? And if not, what? Chip, go ahead, and then James.
My personal view is it's still valid, but recent events, to include the 7th of October, but really over the last few years, the kind of confluence of worsening situation in the West Bank, a more right-leaning government in Israel, tenser ties between the governments of many Arab states and the Palestinians. This is all made a two-state, one-state solution that much more difficult to achieve either route. Again, for Israel to pursue a one-state solution, just occupy the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, annex them whole, and attempt to govern the Palestinian population is not only going to be one heck of a security challenge, it also, in the estimation of many, will really transform the nature of the state of Israel, which has been a vibrant democracy. And if they have significant portions of their population that are merely subjects or secondary citizens, then it can't be a democracy at the same time. And on the same token, pursuit of a two-state solution, who's the partner? Hamas clearly cannot be, at least in my estimation. The Palestinian Authority is still riven with corruption. has weak leadership, has difficulty exerting its authority, even in the West Bank. So it's, I think, a very difficult road to resume meaningful progress towards a two-state solution. Nonetheless, I think it's what must be done, and I would urge the international community to begin.
Sounds like the two-state solution, James Ketterer, is on life support, to use the phrase.
Well, I think Chip very, very accurately describes the situation as it is now, as it is viewed, because of really a set of very other poor and unpalatable options. But I do think, though, too, that pondering the future of the two-state solution versus other things too, to me, and this is not a comment on Chip's commentary. This is just, I mean, a long-standing thought of my own, having lived and worked in Washington as well, that the two-state solution probably has its greatest support within the Beltway in Washington, D.C., and that this conflict, the people often call it intractable. I'd like to be somewhat more optimistic, but as certainly of long standing, has gone on for so long that there is kind of a permanent cottage industry in the Beltway of people who have worked specifically on this for a very long time, and who I think are really highly invested in the two-state solution. And I'm not saying for terrible reasons, because Chip just laid out the case for it, and also the lack of any other lack of any other set of options, not just one option, but set of options that would be at all palatable and doable. I would just say, though, that among Palestinians, among those in other countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and I think also among a fair number of Israelis, there is less enthusiasm for the one-state solution. And I think you see a real dichotomy between the Washington view of the world and the rest of the world's view of Washington on this very question that you've asked, Sarwar. What is the way forward? On the question of leadership, I completely agree that Hamas is beyond the pale, that the Palestinian Authority not only doesn't appear to be a partner that could really deliver on tough issues, but really lacks support of its own people in the West Bank. I would add to that we see a deeply divided Israel. We see, before October 7th, we see a country that was having, a steady stream of very large protests against this government and the things that this Israeli government wanted to do separate from the Palestinian issue. So we see divisions and lack of support of leadership, Hamas, Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli government. And what we see now is kind of a unity government. Even at this moment, it's unclear how much unity there is in this government, and certainly this isn't something that will sustain itself for the kind of long term that would be needed to talk about the kinds of compromises and difficult choices that you're talking about, Sarwar, whether it's a two-state, one-state, or some other kind of solution. This is going to take really heavy lifting by serious leaders, and there seems to be a dearth of this across the board.
Well, let me take a moment to remind our viewers that you're viewing polarislive.com. We are a completely commercial-free station, viewer-supported. You can help us by subscribing to our channel on YouTube and by signing up for the alerts for future programs. With that, I'll come back to our guests today, who are amongst the most informative on the Middle East, Chip Usher and James Ketterer. And Chip and James, I'm going to try and combine two questions into one now. And I'm moving away a bit to a slightly higher plane and connecting what's happening in Gaza and Israel with other countries. And so my question is going to be, the follow-up question is going to be that in your opinion, what is the biggest danger for the US from the conflict? But I want to preface that by saying that increasingly we are seeing the world once again bifurcating into a Western group and the rest. And I mention this because increasingly we hear the complaint that when Russia attacks Ukraine, shuts off its food, shuts off its power, it is called a violation of international law. But when Israel does that, as it is now to Hamas, it's okay almost. We don't use the word violation of international law. And this seems to again be breaking up into two parts, just like the sanctions against Russia did, right? And so I want to ask you to explain how can we call one a violation of international law, not call the other? And then the following question would be, what is the greatest danger the US will face if this continues? So I'll start with you, James, and then we'll go to Chip.
Well, in your first question, seeking absolute consistency in the conduct of foreign policy, I think that we can see all kinds of inconsistencies, and I think it's right. It's fitting and appropriate to point out those inconsistencies, but at the same time, for those who are kind of shocked and appalled at any country in their conduct of foreign policy, that you see inconsistencies, I think that is just a sign of perhaps not paying attention, or close enough, or having a long enough history in looking at these kinds of issues, as all three of us do have a long history in looking at these issues. I don't mean to be flippant about it and to say that it doesn't matter. And on questions of international law, I do think that that it's right for people to hold countries account to those standards. But I don't know where it really gets us in understanding what's going on. As to your second question, which is, what greatest dangers to the U.S. I mean, I think one of them, it's not necessarily a danger, but it's a realization, much like trying to come to grips with the status of the two-state solution, is that we've seen several American administrations come into office, and in one way or another, explicitly or a little less so, try to say that they wanted to de-emphasize the Middle East, to move away from the Middle East, in one case to pivot to Asia. And we see with incidents like this, and this is a very dramatic example of it, but others as well, that the Middle East has a way of not complying with that desire, and just sort of pulling you back in. And I think the Biden administration now is seeing that as well. I mean, obviously they have been working on other Middle Eastern issues, but trying to do it in the way that Chip described, as kind of a discrete way, Saudi-Israeli relations, Iran nuclear deal, what have you. But this kind of issue brings the Middle East back into the kind of the core of U.S. foreign policy issues in its entirety, and having to deal with a wide set of systems, and in terms of dangers, the having to manage the potential of escalation on various other fronts, and the real danger, I think, of stumbling into a shooting war. So I think we can't over dramatize that and say that's necessarily inevitable, but we need to be concerned that with so many moving parts and so many unpredictable actors, that something could happen. There could be some sort of cascading effect, particularly with so much of our firepower in the region right now, that I think we need to be concerned about that sort of immediate concern. More a step above on the strategic level, though, I think we also need to be thinking hard about how we include the Middle East in our overall um, strategic interests, and how we deploy our resources as well. I mean, one of the things I think is worth mentioning, it certainly didn't cause this, but it doesn't help the situation, is that many of our ambassadors across the region are not in place because they have not made it through the Senate confirmation process. And so the own dysfunctions in our own body politic have left us with, with less than ideal resources. I would also say that, of the day-to-day operations of our embassies across the region, we do have military bases in some countries in the region. All of these things need to be thought in terms of how much does the Middle East matter? Why does it matter? And how does it matter? What are we going to do about this? And I feel like we've drifted away from strategic thinking as relates to the Middle East, partially because we've been wanting to move out, and not me personally, but administrations have been wanting to move out. And now is a time for us to, when we hopefully, knock on wood, can move beyond this immediate horrible crisis, this nightmarish crisis, we can really stop and assess this region as it relates to U.S. strategic interests.
But James, and I'm going to now turn over to William Usher. The fact of the matter is that some 70-80% of the world does not agree with the Western view of what's taken place. The same thing happened on Ukraine and Russia, right, where most of the non-Western world disagreed with the sanctions, and the Indian foreign minister was very clear when asked in Europe, how come India is sitting on the fence? And his answer was, hey, we're not sitting on the fence, we're standing our ground. So the point is, if a bulk of the world is saying, hey, listen, if you say that Russia is breaking international law, come up front and say Israel is breaking international law if you want our support. And to both of your questions, that this isn't a bilateral issue, and Chip, you've mentioned really elegantly why the two-state solution may not go anywhere. We need the rest of the world to find this solution because it has ramifications all around. So Chip, with that preface, I'll let you handle this question.
Well, I think the United States' best opportunity to influence Israeli thinking as it conducts its operations in Gaza are left behind the scenes. And I'm sure the Biden administration, we've seen some reflections of this in the media reports over the last few weeks. I think the Biden administration is engaging them vigorously to, as the president said in his speech in Israel, to not lose the moral high ground, not lose their moral compass in their pursuit of Hamas, to be mindful of the risks of escalation and not feeding those risks, and of course doing everything possible to secure the release of these 200 or so hostages that remain in the Gaza Strip. But in terms of the comparison with Ukraine, I think President Biden said exactly the right thing in his address to the nation, that we must be able to engage with both. In the case of Ukraine, a state that was attacked by its neighbor, fighting for its life, there's a moral obligation and a strategic imperative to assist them. In the case of Israel, obviously a very different type of dynamic, but again, a democracy under attack by a terror group. I see a through line there, and I think the United States should not choose the path of foreign policy passivism or passivity, but should remain actively engaged. And I accept that there are polls that may indicate global opinion isn't persuaded by everything that the U.S. says. But the alternative is that China and Russia would have even greater sway over public opinion.
But
can
Chip,
I jump in this, Sarwar? Because
sorry, go ahead, Jim. Something.
Yeah, just also mentioned something that made me think about another function of our embassies around the world, and one that I think, could be supported more robustly than it has been in the past couple of decades. And it might sound like a sort of a separate uh, distracted kind of note, but I think it does fit into this, and that is the public diplomacy function of the State Department and the public diplomacy function of our embassies that are operating around the world and are not directly involved in this immediate crisis that we're talking about today. But they still, Sarwar, you're talking about opinion of leaders and governments around the world and whether they support the US on one policy or another. And there's certainly diplomatic work to be done on those levels. At the same time, and I would say of equal importance, is reaching out to the populations of the world through our public diplomacy resources in a way not to kind of, hoodwink people or propagandize people, but to very clearly and respectfully and consistently explain the position of the United States. Why are we taking the position that we are on Ukraine? Treat people meet them where they are and treat them like adults and explain the position. Not everyone will agree, but I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we duck the question or when we try to hem and haw about it. I think we need to be clear, and we can do this on the diplomatic level, on state to state level, but we can also do it on a more kind of a public diplomacy level through a variety of programs that we run around the world. And I think that that's crucially important. Sarwar, you and I have talked before about, what used to be the U.S. Information Agency and now is the Bureau of Educational Cultural Affairs and the public diplomacy component of the State Department. I think at times like this, sometimes the inclination in Washington is to sort of lean back on those elements of what we do diplomatically. I think that's exactly the wrong way to go. I think we need to be leaning forward. We need to be not necessarily aggressive, but as I said, clear and consistent in our message through those channels.
Well, let me follow through with that, and I'll let Chip answer too. So, winning hearts and minds, as you pointed out, is a central goal of diplomacy. And now I'm taking a world view of what's happening in China and in the Middle East. So I can't help but notice that it is the 10th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative. 130 countries gathered in China because China is putting in $1 trillion to help build bridges, roads, increase the standard of living of over 100 countries, right? And at the same time, what the world is seeing American troops advising Israel, 2 aircraft carriers going out there, the military standing by and flying ammunition to this. I'm not talking about whether this is right or wrong, but to your point about public diplomacy, winning hearts and minds, I mean, what does this picture tell the rest of the non-Western world, which is the largest part of the group that you're trying to attract? So let me turn it over to Chip, because I think there might be some great danger unless we really think through this, as both of you have said. So Chip, a couple of minutes, and then Jim, you can respond.
Well, I mean, I think the Chinese are, with the Belt and Road Initiative and their recent diplomatic forays in the Near East, trying to fill a gap, a perceived gap of lessening U.S. influence in the region. And yes, I think the United States ought to be reinvigorating not just diplomacy, not just the military instrument of power, but also its economic reach and influence. And there are, I think, wonderful opportunities for that, particularly in the technology arena, where U.S. Firms ought to be thinking of doing business, not just in the Near East, but elsewhere in the global South, and can be a highly attractive alternative to doing business with China. And along with business opportunities, there's an opportunity to invest. One of the aspects of the Abraham Accords is that when you look at the countries that are potentially involved, there's tremendous economic upside potential. In the case of Arab Gulf states, they're very interested and keen to diversify their economies, get involved in alternative sources of energy supply, but then also other advanced areas of advanced technology. These are the sorts of things the U.S. should be encouraging strongly and seeking to participate in. And I think that would offer an alternative set of opportunities for states in the region and bolster the interests of the U.S. Because in my experience, every time a country is faced with partnering either with a Chinese or Russian firm on one side, or a U.S. or Western European country or company on the other, they invariably want the U.S. or European partner. Usually the technology is better. Usually the terms are fairer. So there's a great potential there.
So there's a question that bears on what we're talking about, and we need to stick to slide. We have about a few minutes left to go, so just quick answers would be very helpful. So this viewer says, it looks to me that the outcome of the current conflict in Gaza will leave U.S. prestige and political capital in the global South significantly diminished. Another huge gaffe by U.S. foreign policy? Question mark. Just a minute, Jim, and then back to you, Chip.
Sure. So I think that that question is right in line with what we were just talking about.
Is he right? Is this person right?
Because I think we can't have a monolithic view of this. So there are going to be people who are going to be distressed by and angry at certain actions of the government, of the U.S. government, but at the same time can make a distinction between that and the sort of things Chip was just talking about, investing in the U.S., having the U.S. invest in their country. I mean, one of the most popular institutions in Egypt that I was a member of was the American Chamber of Commerce, AmCham. You see them around the world, very popular. Also, American higher education. People can be very angry at U.S. policies, but as John Waterbury said in the former president of the American University of Beirut, John Waterbury from Princeton, he wrote an article that said, hate your policies, love your institutions. What institutions was he talking about? American higher education. It's still the gold standard around the world. And it's not only an important kind of, symbol of the United States, but it's also big business at the same time.
Listen, I'm going to push you on this, and you too, Chip. This viewer is saying, it looks to me that the outcome of the current conflict in Gaza will leave U.S. prestige, political capital in the global South significantly diminished. So do you agree? Do you disagree? Or it's not certain?
Well, I mean, I think that I think people will be in the short term, in some cases, very upset with U.S. decisions. But I think it depends on how you define prestige and influence. And I think in the long run, though China challenges us and though our own actions sometimes undermine us, I am optimistic about the staying power of American prestige.
American prestige. And Chip, what do you think?
The greatest threat to U.S. prestige is the stratagem that Tehran and its allies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia militant groups in Iraq and Syria all share. And that is to drive the U.S. out or to minimize the U.S. footprint in the Near East. That is the greatest threat to our prestige. So to the extent that we are able to definitely use our instruments of national power to assist our Israeli friends in combating Hamas in a humane way, and to work towards a durable solution, not only for the Gaza Strip, but for the Palestinian-Israeli relationship, then that will diminish that risk. So I don't think it's a given that what is underway now is going to be to the detriment of the United States.
Okay,
Is a test for the United States, and we have an opportunity to succeed here.
well, I marvel at how the two of you are handling these really difficult questions that have vexed our biggest diplomats around the world so skillfully. So I'm going to throw another one at you, which is the war between Russia and Ukraine. Right, that was said to be the defining conflict of our time. A new world order was said to be emerging from this. Right, lots of articles and essays written on the generation of a new world order. Well, Ukraine, Russia isn't even on the 10th page of newspapers these days. So is this the Israeli Hamas conflict now assuming that gravity, that a brave new world is going to emerge from this? What do you guys think? Chip, let's start with you and then Jim.
So the current conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza involving Israel are very important strategic tests for the United States. These are conflicts that we need to help our allies prevail because they are a test for democracy versus autocracy. I think there's no question about that. I do think Hamas, a terror group, is pursuing a autocratic view of how to govern in the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people. But in terms of the larger geostrategic picture here, I think the greater competitor is China because they have simply much more resources, many more people, much larger economy, much deeper and broader technological and economic prowess. They are our most serious near competitor, much more so than Russia, and clearly much more so than terror groups like Hamas. So they are interrelated, but if I were to put priority in terms of geostrategic competition, I would say that competition with China, particularly in the technology and economic realm, are paramount or is paramount. But these other issues are important too, and I would join with President Biden in saying it's incumbent upon the United States to engage at all these levels, right? We can and we must.
So listen, we are almost out of time, but there is a final remaining question, and we need to fit this into just a few minutes. If both of you had a chance, a few private moments with President Biden to advise him on what course to take, what advice would you give him? So we'll start with you, Jim, and then you, Chip, and you need to keep it short because that's what the president would give you, an elevator speech.
Right. Well, to follow on what Chip was just talking about, I would urge the president to continue to articulate to the American public and to the Congress of the United States why Ukraine is important. I mean, we were talking before about one of the dangers of the U.S., and I think one of the dangers that faces the U.S. is that we focus on only one crisis at a time, and unfortunately, it's a large and complex world, and I think we cannot take our eyes off of what's happening in Ukraine. I think that Putin has very much kind of, assumed that the U.S. would lose interest, that it would lose political support, and I think that could become a reality if there's not a concerted effort from the White House and from key members of Congress to continue to articulate why this is important and what we're going to do to reach the goals that we seek in Ukraine. And at the same time, I would urge the administration to continue to have those back-channel conversations with the Israelis and not give in to the inevitability of an overall massive invasion of Gaza and a long-term occupation, which I think would be a mistake.
Bing, elevators reach the floor. Your turn, Chip.
Okay, very quickly, I would say with regard to the crisis in Gaza, to continue to help Israel maintain that deterrence against Iran, to try to contain the conflict and keep it minimized. Number two is try to restart the project of the Abraham Accords as soon as is possible for a longer term solution in the Near East. And then, just as James said, I think to as soon as practical, return to the Ukraine situation, get our message out about the need to deal with that problem, as well as the long-term tech competition with China.
Well, listen, Chip Usher, James Ketterer, I really want to thank you for taking all this time from your work to appear on Polaris Live today. It's been a timely and instructive conversation, and I hope you will come back and see us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on PolarisLive.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China and its impact in the world. Until then, goodbye.